Thank you for joining us for Identifying Fit-for-Purpose Formats, a records management seminar delivered by the United States National Archives and Records Administration's National Records Management Training Program. In this session, Kevin DeVorsey discusses the Transfer Guidance Revision Project. Now, let's join the seminar.
This is actually a topic that I've been looking forward to hearing about for quite a while now. And the reason for that is that when we're talking about transfer guidance for permanent electronic records, you know, if you're thinking about the federal government in the year 2013, one of the most important things that NARA can do is to preserve those records that we're currently creating electronically. And so a big part of what this project is about, as Kevin will describe, is to make it easier for agencies to transfer those permanent electronic records to us so that 100 years from now or 200 years from now, somebody will be able to access those. It's been I know it's been a concern of a lot of folks in the records community over the years. How do we transfer in these electronic records? So Kevin DeVorsey is the Supervisory Electronic Records Format Specialist. He's in the Policy Analysis and Enforcement Division of our agency services group at the National Archives and Records Administration. He's physically located in New York City. He directs the team who's responsible for developing the guidance. This guidance defines electronic formats that are appropriate for use by federal agencies that are transferring those permanent records to NARA. So again, this is a group that's looking at ways of streamlining and making it easier for agencies to send those permanent records to the National Archives. So go ahead, Kevin, and take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff. I will start by kind of giving a little bit of background and introducing my team. As Jeff said, I'm a Supervisory Electronic Records Format Specialist, and I have a small team. Their names are up on the screen right now. It's Donald Chalfant, Louise Gunther, and then part-time we have Catherine Nielsen, who's a processing archivist and works with us to make sure that the guidance that we're developing actually matches what happens when we bring in records from agencies. I was going to give a little bit of background on NARA's transfer guidance and what it relates to, and then throw in some fun facts about file formats that hopefully will add to the conversation just in terms of showing what we're dealing with. And then go over the project that we've been working on, which is kind of analyze our current transfer guidance and figure out how to improve it so that it works better for both agencies and the National Archives. And so we did this analysis, and then we developed what are our goals for this revision project and how are we getting there. And the technical white papers up there are kind of a physical mechanism that we're using to analyze formats and make good decisions moving forward. And I'll give a sneak peek of what the new transfer guidance is going to look at, and then discuss it's a related project that's going on simultaneously but somewhat separately, which is identifying what metadata should accompany electronic records. Just as background, what are we talking about when we talk about file formats appropriate for electronic records? In our world, those are things all of us interact with every day, such as Microsoft Word. If we look at a simple format like Microsoft Word or WordPerfect or JPEG images, there are lots of different versions of those formats that have been released through time, and oftentimes they change significantly when they're released, and so that makes it difficult for a place like the National Archives or other repositories that wind up collecting these things. We need to know what things are. So you can imagine hundreds of different agencies all creating electronic records using different software, different versions of formats, and then at the end of the day, they all have to come to the National Archives for preservation, and we have the responsibility of making them accessible to researchers. So we're keenly interested in understanding what are the formats that are in use, and at some point in the future, we're going to have to step in and do something, either translate them into a newer version of the format or transform them into a completely different format. What does the transfer guidance apply to? The National Archives operates under different legislations, and so we have legislation that guides presidential records coming in, congressional records, records of the Supreme Court. But the transfer guidance applies to federal records, and it's written into the CFR as applying to federal records. So that's what I'll be discussing. We have a whole group of people that works on the transfer of electronic records from the White House, and it's fascinating, and we talk a lot. But my project today does not apply to that stream of records coming in. How do we determine what things are? My group, we have a technical understanding of file formats, and we do our best to do research into them. At the end of the day, we're talking about hard drives of electronic records coming to us. And as we ingest them into our repository, ERA, it's very important that we know, yes, this file is a Word document, and in fact, it's a Word 97 document, not a Word 2007 document, so that we can kind of categorize things and know at that point in the future when we need to step in which ones we're going to go at. Since file format extensions don't always change, PDF has been through many, many versions, but the extension PDF has remained the same. We have tools that go in and say this is a PDF 1.4 or 1.7 file. And so for that, having those tools, it's important, and it's one of those things that we use in looking at what's coming to us to see, does this match what we're really looking for through our transfer guidance? I've used the expression transfer guidance, and so what am I talking about? This is an official NARA records lifecycle. This is something I was on a team and we put it together. But we are talking about that period when agencies have records that are scheduled and they are ready to be transferred to the National Archives. We'll get into that in terms of the things that we were looking at with the existing guidance. We had this set of guidance, and agencies are standing up new systems, and so they look to the transfer guidance. They're migrating formats, and so they look to the transfer guidance. And so that was one of the things that we took into consideration under the revision is when should this guidance really be applied, and how far back in time is it going to be useful, and how far forward in time in terms of standing up new systems will it be useful. Okay, so to shift gears a little bit, I gave that brief explanation. We're talking about things like Microsoft Word, image files from a scanner, and one of the most ubiquitous formats out there is the TIFF image. That's one of the things, if you use a scanner in your office, one of the save as options is going to be TIFF. And in my role, format specialist, it's an odd job title, but we spend a lot of time reading specifications. And this is the actual spec for the TIFF version 5.0. And I'm reading along, going through this, and this section is, how do you know that a TIFF file is a TIFF file beyond the file extension TIF or TIFF? And so there's this sentence in here that I've highlighted in red, and it's saying that the number 42 is going to be hidden inside this file after a string, and it was chosen for its deep philosophical significance. And this was written, as you can see, in 1988, and I sat there scratching my head trying to figure out what does 42 stand for? And I actually had to ask a colleague, does anybody know why these computer scientists chose this number? And I don't know, how many people on the line have read or seen the movie The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was a science fiction book and then radio show and TV series and movie. But the answer to the meaning of the universe was the number 42. And so in 1988, I had read this when I was much, much younger and forgotten all about it. But the guys that developed the TIFF image standard didn't, and they wrote it in there. So, these are the kind of things that number 42 is the technical thing hidden away inside every TIFF image that tells you what that file is. And those are the kind of things the National Archives, we have software that goes through and verifies that in addition to having that file extension, TIFF, it actually has that number 42 and other things to make sure that it's constructed the way the specification says it should be. All right. So I was hired into my position in 2010, and given the express job of, we have this transfer guidance, but it's been somewhat problematic. It's confusing to agencies in some ways, and we're receiving formats that aren't covered by it, and so we really need you to go in and look at it and develop a better way where we can update things more easily. So I had come from preservation programs at the National Archives, and so I wasn't, the transfer guidance wasn't second nature to me. I wasn't overly familiar with it. And so the first step was, understand what is this thing, how is it constructed, what is the motivation, and then try and figure out, learning from others, from agencies and staff at the National Archives, what are the problems with it that we can improve upon. And so if you are familiar with this guidance, you'll see it's written up into the CFR. It's a very, it's a textual way of describing these very technical things, which are file formats. So we've done our best to go through and say, here are the things that we are interested in. The other thing to keep in mind, this guidance was developed between 2002 and 2004 as a part of a presidential e-government initiative. And so NARA was the lead partner, but we were partners working with agencies. And so we developed, as a part of this partnership, identified what are the priority formats that we should address by having guidance. So it really is a reflection of that period of time in 2002. This is before we have the Electronic Records Archive, before we can ingest files onto spinning disks. We had systems in place, but we were parking files onto magnetic tapes. And so the ability to interact with those files was much more limited than it is today. And so our transfer guidance reflects that. It really did serve the purpose of trying to funnel down the numbers of formats that are in use and bring in only ones that we had pretty good assurance we would be able to preserve for the long term. So here's just a graphic where I tried to capture, what are the guidance products that we have. And you can see we have a category for web content records, digital photographs, geospatial records, and then one that's separate, specific to PDF files, and then scan text and email. They finished the project and instantly realized that there was a need for additional guidance. One of the things that jumped out is there's no specific guidance for audio-video records. And so they developed over on the right in yellow, we started putting out FAQs, kind of bulletins to support the transfer guidance to cover some of these other categories that weren't explicitly covered. And perhaps the most important one up there is the FAQs about selecting sustainable formats. So, this is all information that we learned and looked at, and then we kind of digested this and identified, what are the issues with it. And from my kind of technical point of view, they demonstrate a preference for standards-based formats. But unfortunately, agencies in the course of their business don't always pick preservation formats. You have business needs. Not all of your records are permanent. And so agencies don't pick what might be the best for the National Archives when you're working. So in those cases where you've been using a format that we haven't identified, something has to happen. Somebody's got to transform it into a better format. And we've had that conversation over and over again where we don't have the money to do this, we don't have the staffing to do this, and we don't necessarily have the expertise to do it in a way that's going to maintain the fidelity of the original record. And so at the end of the day, they've proven to be an obstacle for NARA and agencies in terms of having a steady stream of electronic records coming in the door. So we digested all that, and so in developing what do we want to do in the future, if we could do anything, what would we do? And so one of our goals was package the guidance in a way that it is very clear what we're asking for, make it as brief as possible so it's not these technical descriptions of what's going on under the hood, and then provide consistency so that it's impossible for me to pull out a crystal ball and say what formats we're going to be using 20 years from now. But we can say what are the things that we're very, very interested in, and then we can work and look at formats as they come out and hopefully update our guidance more frequently so it's more responsive to what's going on out in agencies. And so it needs to be flexible and extendable in the future. And then we wanted to balance the preference for open standards with the business needs of agencies. And so take a hard look and say, what have we learned about file formats? And, are proprietary formats always bad? Has history shown that we're going to be in a lot of trouble if we were to bring some of these things in? One of these things I mentioned, the transformation from one format to another, and that's trying to identify in our transfer guidance formats that do a good job of matching record behavior. What is it that when records are appraised and agencies identify which ones are permanent, what is it about those records that we need to capture and preserve for the long term? So what formats support that? We don't want to pick a format that's going to truncate things. If the original record was a motion picture, we wouldn't want to create a still image of that. That wouldn't achieve the goal of preserving what's important about that motion picture. And then acknowledge, we're not parking things on tape. We're able to interact with records in real time on spinning disks. And so what does that mean? How many more formats can we accept because of that? And then, really make it a little more nuanced and stand up guidance as appropriate for transfer, and then support it by putting up additional guidance. If you're interested in scanning documents, that's going to look slightly different. We'll put up records creation guidance and other forms of guidance to support the life cycle of electronic records, so that it's not just, if you're interested in formats, all we have is this one place for you to look. Obviously, since 2004, a lot of new formats have come out, and we learned that there's increasing use and scheduling of audio and video files, and so we wanted to expand so that we'd be able to give out some guidance on that. And then take a hard look at commonly used formats and see, are they so bad that we should say no to them? And at the end of the day, we wanted to minimize that kind of point of conflict where an agency's done something that doesn't match our guidance and something needs to happen. And so those are kind of the fodder that we had in the back of our minds when we were putting this together. Can we achieve these goals, and can we make things easier for people to work with? So where are we now? We've come up with these goals that we have for ourselves, and we've put into place the revised guidance, and we are just about to release it internally for NARA, and that'll probably take a month or 6 weeks. We have a new kind of review process at the National Archives, and then it'll go out for government-wide review. As a part, I mentioned earlier that we were doing these things called format white papers, where we really look at formats to make good decisions about, are they bad or are they good, and can we document why they are bad or good. So we, in our work with agencies and the processing archivists at the National Archives, saw what are the formats that are the questions for people. And so we did analysis of about 50 of those formats, which were the highest interest formats, represented the largest number and volume of records. And we've put that all together into this revised transfer guidance. Simultaneously, I mentioned we're also developing this metadata guidance, which is, what is that core metadata, or the information about electronic records that needs to accompany them on transfer. in the past, in the paper record world, there might be paper indexes or finding aids or things like that. And so what is the analogous set of information with electronic records that we need agencies to provide to us so that we can do our jobs in the future? And it's interesting, more and more often agencies are using things like SharePoint or an e-archiving solution, and so they have these kind of built-in mechanisms to conduct searches across the title of a PDF file or the photographer's name in an image file. But we're not necessarily getting that information when the electronic records are transferred to us. And so we're going to try and package, what are the core things that we really need when you transfer electronic records, so that we can understand what is this body of information that we've got on our hands now. So in the original transfer guidance, we put out, guidance around PDFs or scanned text. And we laid out our requirements and listed the few formats under each of those categories that we considered to be acceptable. So there was a certain inflexibility to that that has caused a few problems. And so the approach that we're taking now is we're going to identify the preferred formats. And those are the formats that are very, very good, and we encourage agencies to adopt them and use them. We'll also have the category of acceptable formats, which, we're not going to jump up and down in happiness over, but they will be fine for our purposes. Since we've had transfer guidance going back actually before 2002, our original transfer guidance was actually dictated what kind of magnetic tapes you could use, and then said records should be in ASCII or EBCDIC character sets. We want to have the ability to kind of retire formats as they're no longer, if they start to pose problems themselves, and we've seen examples of this. And so I'm using that term sunset. And then if we are aware, hopefully this will be a very rare instance of formats that are just plain bad. We want to be able to single those out. But in general, it's for each of the categories of electronic records, we'll say there are preferred formats, there are acceptable formats, and then give a window of time for ones that we would love for agencies to be able to turn over in the not-so-distant future so that we can go ahead and process them before we encounter problems. So in the original guidance, I pointed out that we didn't have anything covering audio or video. We also didn't have anything for architectural drawings or computer-aided design files. And so we kind of stepped back and looked at what are the categories that if I was a records officer and I had records ready to transfer, what are the groupings that would be meaningful for me to look at? And so we put these categories together, and hopefully they provide a bucket that will be recognizable to people. The other thing you'll see, previously there was specific guidance to PDF records. That's gone. And so what we've done is we consider PDF to be a format, and so it will appear wherever it is appropriate. And more people can do architectural drawings using 3D PDF. And so if that's considered appropriate for that category, it'll appear down there. For digital still images, PDF would appear there. For text, it would appear there. So it's no longer being singled out as a specific guidance project, but just being rolled in as appropriate into other categories. All right, so I mentioned that the FAQ on sustainable formats and its importance. And so I thought I'd give an example of why is the sustainability of formats important, and what do we mean when we say sustainability? Since this is kind of key to how we're looking at formats and making decisions over which ones should we prefer to accept and which ones will we accept and which ones do we not want to accept. Hopefully, GIFs are an interesting case. Graphics interchange format, those little brief animations that appear on the web now, those are GIF files. Last year, It was recognized as a verb because it has this resurgence in popularity. The Oxford English Dictionary added GIF as a word. It was named Word of the Year, I think, by Wired magazine. And it was CompuServe. If anybody as old as I am remembers that CompuServe was one of those original Internet service providers that we used to dial up onto the Internet. And they developed it in 1987 as an efficient way to move images around, because TIFFs and other formats at the time were pretty big and clunky and just couldn't be pushed over a phone line well. They chose to use a form of compression called LZW compression that it turned out Unisys owned the patents to. And they started pursuing patent claims against CompuServe and other people. And I actually remember this. I was working in a museum, and the software we were using to create thumbnail images quit supporting GIF. And so we looked into it, and it turned out it was a result of these patent claims. This was very dramatic across the world, and it actually wound up in alternate formats being adopted and created. Happily, the claims expired in 2003 in the United States, and it never really went away despite all this kind of things going on in the background and other formats being created. But it's kind of hung in there and has seen this resurgence in the last couple of years, which is interesting. But it is that issue of, what if somebody asserts a patent claim? Is this format proprietary, and there's a chance that we could lose access to it? These are considerations that are part of the sustainability of a format. Will we have problems continuing to provide access to this in the future? So how do we measure it's not always as clear-cut as this case with the GIF format, where there's a patent claim. It's a lot more subtle than that oftentimes. And what I have on the screen, these measurements of sustainability, were actually developed by the Library of Congress, and I've included the link down at the bottom. And just to go through them quickly, disclosure, is it possible for the National Archives to put our hands on the complete specification that tells us technically, if we wanted to hire a programmer, what they would need to know to open these things? If all the software went away, if the company went bankrupt, all of that kind of stuff, can we still get our hands on things? The option is that idea of ubiquity. Is it widely used? Are there lots of different programs that will provide access to it? Is there a chance that this thing's going to disappear in the next 5 years, the way some programs or formats have, things like WordStar that have kind of gone the way of the dinosaur? Transparency is this thing, the new docx Microsoft Word file is, in essence, XML bundled up inside a zip folder. And so you can use other tools besides Microsoft Word to go in there and analyze that text. And that is transparency. A lot of formats are the previous version of Microsoft Word, Word 97, was wrapped up as a binary file, and you really needed Microsoft Word to get in there to analyze it. If you tried to open it up with a basic text editor, you're going to see a lot of gobbledygook. External dependencies, and that is the idea that you are required to use a particular type of hardware or software to get to it. It's dependent on Microsoft Windows, or it's dependent on the Macintosh operating system. I've discussed the impact of patents with the GIF format. Technical protection mechanisms are one of the ones that are of greatest interest to the National Archives, and it's very easy for us to password protect or encrypt files today, and it's common. And we understand that agencies have a business need to do that. However, if we have permanent records that are transferred to us and they're password protected, then we're not going to be able to access them in the future. And so it's not that is a negative mark against the sustainability of the format that it supports encryption or password protection. We just want to make sure that it's there so that we can specifically ask agencies to turn it off at the point of transfer. jumping back to external dependencies, I didn't finish that thought. If you look on your hard drive, if you're using Microsoft Windows or Macintosh, inside the system folder, there's a folder of all of the fonts that your computer uses, the Times New Roman, Courier. And it's very, very common for applications to, instead of storing all of those things locally in each Word document that you make, it just points instead to the system folder. And so there's an external dependency. If you choose a font set that is uncommon and then transfer that file to the National Archives and we don't have access to that same font set, the file is going to look different to us. And so that idea that there is an external dependency between that file and those fonts. And so wherever possible, we want to avoid that, and we do that by asking agencies to embed those fonts, to make sure that if there's any fonts that are specific to interpreting this information encoded in this file, that we will be able to do it in the future. Okay, so here, and this will apply to the question of docx and pptx, how do we do this? And we sit down and we actually do this analysis of all these formats, and we look at all these information sources that are out there. There are these standards organizations, the ISO and ANSI. In some cases, if it's not a ISO standard, then we'll go to the corporate site and we do our best to find all the detailed technical information we can. I mentioned the Library of Congress has a site on format sustainability, the National Archives of the United Kingdom. California Digital Library has this unified digital format registry, and of course, Wikipedia. So I use that expression, fit for purpose. We really are trying to figure out what is the best fit for use with permanent records, recognizing that that's not always going to be a preservation format. It's just what is the right one that accomplishes the job that the agency needs and then allows the National Archives to do what we need to do. And so we've learned that the conventional wisdom is not always correct. Completely open formats may not always be the best choice. And proprietary formats aren't always so bad. And I'll give some examples. And so the conventional wisdom it would be that Microsoft Word is bad because it's a proprietary format. But with the release of the docx, I'll call them all the docx, which is the XML-based formats, Microsoft actually went through the standards development process. And so there's an international standard that applies to the docx format. And that's all the technical information that you would need to create an application that could interpret that. I'm not going to go so far as to say that it's a great format. Microsoft being Microsoft didn't release everything. They have their own business interests to look after. So is it as open as something like OpenOffice? No. But it's probably good enough. There is this technical information. There's multiple applications that you can use to open them now. So it is much, much better than the old Word 97 formats. Our existing transfer guidance, we identified FDTS as a format for geospatial formats. And this was a format developed by the Geological Survey. But at this point, if you go to their website, it's no longer supported, and the information is up there for historical reasons. So here's this case that we identified a format, a completely open format, but it just never took off. And so it might not be the best choice for that kind of geospatial information, since it's going to be increasingly difficult to track down that technical information or people that are familiar with using it. And so, as I said, in the case of Microsoft, proprietary formats aren't always so bad, especially since software vendors are doing a better job of releasing information about those formats so that we can make technical decisions moving forward. So I mentioned, we have this small team of people, and we didn't want it to be us throwing darts at a dartboard when it came to picking good formats and bad formats. We wanted to do some kind of analytical work where we could record what we're seeing and how we're making these decisions of good versus bad. And so we developed this kind of template where we can discuss exactly what it is we're talking about, what's the format and the version of the format, and what are other people saying about it, and then some technical information of how you identify it so that it's clear to everybody what it is we're talking about. And then boil down those sustainability questions, concepts into a series of basically yes-no questions. So we could go through and come up with something that we could actually crunch numbers and it not just be a subjective decision on our part. And so we have done this for these 50 formats, and the result is we're able to populate these columns of preferred, acceptable, and imminent transfer. And so you'll see this is drafts. It may or may not look like this in the final released version, but you can see over on the right, EBCDIC is a character set developed by IBM used for mainframe data, and it's just mainframes are falling out of use. We recognize there's still a lot of EBCDIC out there, but it could be the type of format that we say, in the next 5 years, please transfer all of your EBCDIC, because the specialization and the people that we have on staff that are familiar with EBCDIC, there are fewer than in the past. And so just as an example, that is how we're getting to that point of being able to make these decisions. So I mentioned metadata, and as we transition from paper to more and more electronic records, our need for the accompanying metadata has increased as well. There are more and more metadata-rich formats. If you right-click on a Word document, you'll see there's the title, author, date, modified date. That's metadata. So more and more it's there. It's just when it's populated inconsistently, it makes our job more difficult. You can imagine all of the digital images we receive from agencies. We have a staff in still pictures that it would make their lives so much easier if the photographer's name was always in the same place and the caption was always correct and done the same way. And so those are examples of metadata, and so we're going to work with agencies and our internal custodial units to try and develop something that is easy to understand and can be used as a guide when populating metadata or putting together finding aids or indexes in your systems. And it's all for, we simply can't double-click on every file coming through our door, so we need to automate as much as possible. And so if we have well-developed, consistently populated metadata, that will make things infinitely easier for us to process and make available in the future. Here are some questions. We are keenly interested in working with agencies to make sure that we're identifying good formats and the formats that are of interest to you. There is that question with metadata, what are you using? Are you using metadata standards? If you have an e-archiving system, can you export kind of the index alongside it, or is that impossible? These are the kind of questions we're trying to work through to identify what's realistic for us to ask agencies. We don't want to put up a bunch of hoops for people to jump through that are impossible to meet. So at the end of the day, we want to wind up with, what is this core that we know is critical and it should be possible for agencies to comply with. So that is the end of the formal part, and I put up, this is off my iPad. It's a real screenshot. There's no Photoshop involved here. You may have to ask Siri a couple of times, but if you ask what the meaning of life is, sooner or later you're going to get the number 42.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you found this seminar useful. For more information about the U.S. National Records Management Training Program, please visit www.archives.gov. Also, our current workshop schedule for both face-to-face and web-based training is available online at nara.learn.com.